Imagine being kicked out of a restaurant just because of your skin color. But what if the person you're dismissing is the one with the power to change everything? Watch as one woman stands up to racism, turning a moment of injustice into a powerful lesson for all. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now, let's get started. The sun had just begun to dip behind the city skyline, casting a warm golden hue over the bustling streets. Inside a cozy, well-loved restaurant at the heart of the city, the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversations filled the air. It was one of those places that people visited over and over again, where familiar faces greeted you as you walked in, and the smell of freshly prepared food made you feel at home. The atmosphere was casual but inviting, with mismatched chairs, walls lined with pictures of happy customers, and a small jazz band playing softly in the corner. It was the kind of place that made you feel like part of a bigger family, no matter who you were. At a table near the window, Tasha sat quietly, scanning the menu. But her mind wasn't on the food. She was here on business. Tasha had walked through these doors countless times before. But today, she wasn't a customer. She was here for her routine health inspection. As a health inspector, Tasha had an important job, one that required precision, professionalism, and a sharp eye for detail. Over the years, she'd faced many challenges, from difficult restaurant owners to skeptical staff, but she'd learned to navigate it all with confidence. Her job was to ensure that the food people ate was safe, the kitchen was sanitary, and the establishment adhered to health codes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was vital work, and Tasha took it seriously. Tasha was a black woman, and while she'd never let her ethnicity define her, she knew that it often shaped the way people saw her. She'd learned early in her career not to back down when faced with prejudice. Over the years, Tasha had built a reputation for being professional, knowledgeable, and firm. She had worked hard to get where she was, often working twice as hard to prove herself in spaces where she wasn't always welcomed. Despite the hurdles she had faced, Tasha had never wavered from her mission. She was proud of her work and her ability to make a difference, even when it wasn't easy. As she stood up to introduce herself to the restaurant manager, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am," Officer Jake said as he approached her. His uniform was crisp, his tone dismissive. "You can't be here. You need to leave." Tasha paused, surprised by his bluntness. Officer Jake was a local cop who patrolled the area regularly. He'd seen her before, but never really paid attention to who she was or what she did. His judgment had already been made. He looked at her, taking in her appearance, her dark skin, her professional but simple attire, and assumed she was just another customer. "Excuse me?" Tasha asked, trying to remain calm despite the discomfort that was starting to rise inside her. "You heard me," Officer Jake replied, glancing at her once more, his expression flat. "This is a private place. You need to leave." Tasha stood still for a moment, processing what had just happened. She could feel the tension building. She had dealt with this type of thing before, people assuming she didn't belong, people questioning her presence. But she wasn't about to let this moment go without standing up for herself. "Actually, I'm here on business," she said, her voice steady. "I'm the health inspector." Officer Jake raised an eyebrow, his disbelief written clearly on his face. The sudden shift in his demeanor was almost imperceptible, but Tasha could see it. He had judged her before even asking any questions, but now, as her words sank in, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Yet, his arrogance made it clear that he wasn't ready to admit his mistake. Not yet, anyway. The restaurant owner, who had been watching from the corner of the room, stepped forward, confusion etched on his face. "Is everything all right here, officer?" he asked, looking between Tasha and Jake. Tasha's heart raced. She knew she was walking a fine line between standing her ground and diffusing the tension. She didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but she also wasn't about to back down. "This woman," Jake began, gesturing toward Tasha, but his voice trailed off as he realized the weight of his words. The situation was far more complicated than he had imagined. Imagine being kicked out of a restaurant just because of your skin color. But what if the person you're dismissing is the one with the power to change everything? Watch as one woman stands up to racism, turning a moment of injustice into a powerful lesson for all. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now, let's get started. The sun had just begun to dip behind the city skyline, casting a warm golden hue over the bustling streets. Inside a cozy, well-loved restaurant at the heart of the city, the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversations filled the air. It was one of those places that people visited over and over again, where familiar faces greeted you as you walked in, and the smell of freshly prepared food made you feel at home. The atmosphere was casual but inviting, with mismatched chairs, walls lined with pictures of happy customers, and a small jazz band playing softly in the corner. It was the kind of place that made you feel like part of a bigger family, no matter who you were. At a table near the window, Tasha sat quietly, scanning the menu. But her mind wasn't on the food. She was here on business. Tasha had walked through these doors countless times before. But today, she wasn't a customer. She was here for her routine health inspection. As a health inspector, Tasha had an important job, one that required precision, professionalism, and a sharp eye for detail. Over the years, she'd faced many challenges, from difficult restaurant owners to skeptical staff, but she'd learned to navigate it all with confidence. Her job was to ensure that the food people ate was safe, the kitchen was sanitary, and the establishment adhered to health codes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was vital work, and Tasha took it seriously. Tasha was a black woman, and while she'd never let her ethnicity define her, she knew that it often shaped the way people saw her. She'd learned early in her career not to back down when faced with prejudice. Over the years, Tasha had built a reputation for being professional, knowledgeable, and firm. She had worked hard to get where she was, often working twice as hard to prove herself in spaces where she wasn't always welcomed. Despite the hurdles she had faced, Tasha had never wavered from her mission. She was proud of her work and her ability to make a difference, even when it wasn't easy. As she stood up to introduce herself to the restaurant manager, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am," Officer Jake said as he approached her. His uniform was crisp, his tone dismissive. "You can't be here. You need to leave." Tasha paused, surprised by his bluntness. Officer Jake was a local cop who patrolled the area regularly. He'd seen her before, but never really paid attention to who she was or what she did. His judgment had already been made. He looked at her, taking in her appearance, her dark skin, her professional but simple attire, and assumed she was just another customer. "Excuse me?" Tasha asked, trying to remain calm despite the discomfort that was starting to rise inside her. "You heard me," Officer Jake replied, glancing at her once more, his expression flat. "This is a private place. You need to leave." Tasha stood still for a moment, processing what had just happened. She could feel the tension building. She had dealt with this type of thing before, people assuming she didn't belong, people questioning her presence. But she wasn't about to let this moment go without standing up for herself. "Actually, I'm here on business," she said, her voice steady. "I'm the health inspector." Officer Jake raised an eyebrow, his disbelief written clearly on his face. The sudden shift in his demeanor was almost imperceptible, but Tasha could see it. He had judged her before even asking any questions, but now, as her words sank in, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Yet, his arrogance made it clear that he wasn't ready to admit his mistake. Not yet, anyway. The restaurant owner, who had been watching from the corner of the room, stepped forward, confusion etched on his face. "Is everything all right here, officer?" he asked, looking between Tasha and Jake. Tasha's heart raced. She knew she was walking a fine line between standing her ground and diffusing the tension. She didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but she also wasn't about to back down. "This woman," Jake began, gesturing toward Tasha, but his voice trailed off as he realized the weight of his words. The situation was far more complicated than he had imagined. Tasha stepped into the restaurant, her leather briefcase firmly in her hand. She had done this hundreds of times before, routine health inspections across the city. The restaurant was busy, as usual, with waiters rushing between tables and the kitchen bustling behind the swinging doors. The warmth of the space wrapped around her as she walked in, a slight smile on her lips as she looked around at the familiar, cozy setting. She had been here before, but today she wasn't a customer. She had a job to do. Tasha moved towards the counter where the manager typically sat. As she walked, she couldn't help but notice the low hum of conversation from the patrons, laughter, clinking silverware, and the occasional shout of a server calling out an order. Everything seemed normal, but something in the air felt different today, almost tense. Before she could get too far, Officer Jake appeared, stepping into her path with a suddenness that startled her. She recognized him instantly. Officer Jake, the local cop who patrolled the area. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his uniform with the air of someone who thought he commanded respect, even when he didn't deserve it. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice stern and cold, cutting through the chatter around them. "You need to leave. We don't allow people like you in here." Tasha stopped in her tracks, her mind reeling for a moment. People like you? She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, a feeling she had long ago learned to ignore. It was a feeling she had experienced far too many times in her life. Being judged, assumed to be something she wasn't, simply because of the color of her skin. She blinked, surprised by his words, but quickly regained her composure. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. She wasn't about to let him intimidate her. "You heard me," Officer Jake replied, his tone dismissive, not even bothering to look her in the eye. "This place doesn't serve people like you. You need to leave." Tasha's first instinct was to brush it off, but something in his attitude stopped her. His gaze flicked over her, appraising her as though she didn't belong in the same space as the people dining in the restaurant. It was an assumption, a clear judgment, based entirely on the way she looked, her skin, her race. For a split second, her heart raced. She knew exactly what was happening. She had encountered racism before, but this was different. This man wasn't just assuming she was out of place. He was telling her to leave. He was acting with the authority of his badge, pushing her out of a public place without any reason or respect. But Tasha wasn't about to let this go unchecked. She stood tall, her shoulders squared. She was a professional. She had a job to do. "I'm not a customer," she said calmly, looking him directly in the eye. "I'm the health inspector. I'm here for my routine inspection." Officer Jake seemed to falter for a moment, as though the words didn't register immediately. He blinked a couple of times, his eyes narrowing slightly. He clearly wasn't prepared for this response. The arrogance that had once been present in his stance began to waver, but not completely. Instead of backing off, he crossed his arms, still blocking her path. "Health inspector?" he repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "Don't think I've seen you around before. Are you sure you're with the city?" Tasha sighed, trying to keep her voice as even as possible. She had dealt with these moments of disbelief before, where people couldn't fathom that she could be in a position of authority. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her qualifications based on her appearance, and it wouldn't be the last. But today it stung more than usual. "Yes, I'm sure," she said, reaching into her bag to pull out her identification card. She handed it to him without hesitation. "You can check. I'm here to ensure the restaurant is meeting health code standards. That's my job." The officer took the card, eyeing it for a moment. Tasha could feel the weight of the silence between them, the tension building. The seconds felt like minutes. He glanced up at her, then down at the card again, clearly not knowing how to proceed. There was no snappy response, no further dismissal. His judgment was still clouded, but now there was confusion mixed with it. In the meantime, the restaurant owner, who had been standing behind the bar, had taken notice of the scene unfolding. His brow furrowed as he stepped forward, a look of concern spreading across his face. "Is there a problem here, officer?" the owner asked, his voice calm but curious. He looked between Tasha and Jake, clearly sensing the tension in the air. The moment was thick with uncomfortable silence. The staff had started to gather, watching the exchange unfold with a mix of confusion and discomfort. They didn't know who Tasha was. To them, she was just a black woman standing in front of the officer. To them, she could have been anyone, another customer, another face in the crowd. But to Officer Jake, she was something else. She was an inconvenience, a disruption. And he wasn't about to back down, not without putting up a fight. "Yeah, there's a problem," Jake said, his voice tinged with frustration. "This woman," he gestured toward Tasha, as if her presence itself was a crime. "She doesn't belong here. I'm just making sure she leaves." The restaurant owner's confusion deepened, his gaze flicking between Jake and Tasha. He didn't know her, didn't recognize her, but something about this felt wrong. The way Jake spoke, the way he was handling the situation, it didn't sit right. He could feel the uncomfortable energy filling the space, and the last thing he wanted was to make it worse. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for this," the owner said, turning to Tasha. "But I think there's been a misunderstanding." Tasha took a deep breath, trying to remain composed. She didn't want to escalate things. But the more she stood there, the more she could feel the weight of the moment. The staff, now fully aware of what was happening, were watching her carefully. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for something bigger. Her voice remained calm, but there was a firmness in her words that carried authority. "I'm here to do my job," she said, turning back to Officer Jake. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to ensure the health and safety of this restaurant, just like I do at every other establishment in this city." The restaurant owner's face softened, and he nodded, his hands raised slightly as though signaling for peace. Right. We'll get this cleared up." But it was too late. The damage had been done. The seed of doubt had been planted, not just in Officer Jake's mind, but in the minds of everyone present. The tension in the air was palpable, and it seemed like everyone, except for Tasha, was waiting for the next move. Tasha stood her ground, knowing that the next few moments could define everything. The officer had already crossed a line. What came next would depend on whether she could make him realize just how wrong he was. The restaurant was quieter now, the background noise of clinking plates and soft chatter all but silenced by the confrontation unfolding near the entrance. Officer Jake stood still holding Tasha's health inspector ID in his hand, his gaze shifting from the card to her, then to the surrounding staff, who had all become silent witnesses to the exchange. The confusion in the air was thick, and the tension was nearly unbearable. Tasha had been through moments like this before, times when she was judged based on the color of her skin rather than the work she did. But something about this moment felt different. The weight of the officer's assumption, his casual dismissal of her, felt sharper. He was a figure of authority, someone who was supposed to protect and serve. But here he was, wielding his badge to create division instead of unity. She felt a fire building inside her, but she didn't let it explode. She knew that getting emotional would only play into the narrative he expected. Instead, she drew a breath, steadying herself. This wasn't the time for anger. It was the time for clarity, for standing firm in her truth. She was here for a reason, and she wasn't going to let anyone push her out because of their own ignorance. "I'm the health inspector," Tasha said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm here to do my job." Her words were direct and simple. There was no need for embellishment, no need for anger. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. Instead, she made it clear that she was not to be underestimated, not to be dismissed. She was exactly where she belonged. Officer Jake blinked, his face frozen for a moment. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then paused, unsure of how to respond. His cheeks flushed slightly, the embarrassment beginning to creep in. His earlier confidence had been shattered, his assumptions dismantled in a single sentence. It was the kind of moment that made a person question their own judgment, but Jake wasn't quite ready to admit his mistake yet. He tried to save face, but the words caught in his throat. For a moment, the restaurant felt like it was holding its breath. The owner, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Tasha and the officer. He had been standing there as a passive observer, unsure of what to do, but now he could feel the gravity of the situation. The silence hung thick in the air, and he realized how wrong the entire exchange had been. "I apologize," the restaurant owner said, his voice faltering as he approached Tasha. "This shouldn't have happened. We don't treat people like that here." He glanced at Officer Jake, his tone shifting from confusion to reprimand. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Please, if you'd like, I'll have the staff assist you with your inspection right away." Tasha nodded, her face composed. "Thank you," she said quietly, though her mind was swirling with a mix of frustration and sadness. It wasn't the apology that mattered. It was the fact that it had taken this much to get to this point. She was a health inspector, a professional who had worked for years to earn her position, and yet here she was, being treated like an outsider because of her appearance. As the owner turned to direct the staff, Tasha could feel the eyes of the other employees on her. They hadn't seen what had just transpired, hadn't heard the words that had been thrown her way. But now, they were looking at her with a new sense of awareness. Whether they liked it or not, they had witnessed an injustice, and it was hard to ignore the discomfort in the room. Tasha took a step back, folding her arms, but she didn't back down. She wasn't going to let the situation dictate her reaction. Her dignity was all she had in moments like these, and she wasn't about to hand it over to anyone who tried to take it away from her. For a brief second, she locked eyes with Officer Jake again. His expression was a mix of confusion, guilt, and something else. Maybe recognition. He had misjudged her, treated her as if she were less than. But now there was a slight hesitation in his stance. He didn't know how to fix what he had done. How could he? The damage had been done in front of a crowd, and there was no way to undo it. "Racism doesn't have a place in my world," Tasha said, her words clear and cutting. She didn't raise her voice, didn't shout at him or make a scene. Instead, her words were spoken with quiet authority, carrying the weight of years of experience, years of standing tall in the face of prejudice and not letting it break her. "Especially not in my work. I'm here to do my job, nothing more." Officer Jake looked at her, his face paling slightly. He opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, but then seemed to think better of it. There was nothing he could say that would erase the words he had already spoken. Nothing that could undo the damage he had caused. He was a man of authority, a police officer sworn to uphold justice, and yet here he was, using his badge to try and humiliate someone for no reason other than the color of her skin. The restaurant owner shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Tasha and Jake, unsure of what to do next. It was clear that he too had just realized how deeply wrong the situation was, but the damage had already been done. Tasha wasn't a stranger to these moments, but they still hurt every time. Tasha took a step forward, her composure never wavering. She wasn't angry, No, this wasn't about anger. This was about respect and dignity, her own, and the respect that she deserved from others. "Sir," Tasha said, addressing the owner, though her eyes never left Officer Jake. "I'm here to do my job. I expect to be treated like any other inspector regardless of my appearance." The owner nodded, and there was a sincerity in his gesture that reassured Tasha, but it didn't make up for the moment that had just unfolded. Officer Jake stood still trying to process what had just happened. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by confusion, and beneath that, a flicker of shame. He had assumed that because of her skin, she didn't belong here, and now that assumption had come crashing down. But would he own up to it? Would he acknowledge the harm he had caused? Tasha could feel her pulse slow. She wasn't going to let the officer off the hook, but she also wasn't going to waste any more energy on him. She had learned long ago that people like Officer Jake weren't going to change in a single moment. What mattered now was how she moved forward, how she held on to her dignity and continued her work with strength. She turned to the staff, her expression softening, her voice calm. "If you could direct me to the kitchen, I'll get started on the inspection," she said, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. She wasn't going to let one man's ignorance define her day or her life. She had a job to do, and she would do it, no matter how many times she had to fight to be seen for who she truly was. The tension in the room slowly began to ease as the staff led her toward the back, but the awkwardness remained. Officer Jake, though still standing at the entrance, had learned something today, whether he wanted to admit it or not. The confrontation had ended, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Officer Jake stood just inside the restaurant, his posture slumped, his mind racing. He had spent the last few minutes watching Tasha walk toward the kitchen, her head held high, her professionalism unshaken. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. Jake wasn't used to feeling like this. He was a man of authority, someone who had always prided himself on doing what he thought was right. But today he had been wrong, dead wrong, and the realization hit him hard. He had judged a woman not based on her actions, not on her words, but solely because of her appearance. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a moment of prejudice, one that he couldn't deny, no matter how much he tried to justify it. He had assumed she didn't belong simply because of the color of her skin. And the worst part? He hadn't even questioned it. Jake took a deep breath, his eyes following Tasha as she disappeared into the back of the restaurant. His mind kept replaying the moment he had told her to leave, the way he had dismissed her without a second thought. He hadn't seen her as a professional. He had seen her as something less than. And in doing so, he had taken away her dignity, even if just for a moment. The weight of his actions sat heavily on his shoulders. He needed to apologize. But more than that, he needed to acknowledge the harm he had caused, not just to Tasha, but to the entire room, to everyone who had witnessed his behavior. He wasn't just wrong. He had been part of something that perpetuated an ugly truth. Racism, even in its most subtle forms, still existed in places where people thought it had been eradicated. And he, of all people, should have known better. Tasha had stood her ground with such quiet strength. She hadn't gotten angry, hadn't lashed out in frustration. She had simply spoken her truth, remained calm, and let her actions speak louder than any words could. It was a lesson Jake wasn't going to forget. After a few moments, he took a tentative step toward the kitchen where Tasha had gone. He felt nervous, unsure of how she would react. He had no idea if she would even want to hear what he had to say, but he couldn't just let this go. Meanwhile, the restaurant owner, still standing near the front, had been processing everything that had transpired. He hadn't expected anything like this to happen, least of all in his restaurant, a place he had always prided himself on being welcoming to everyone. But today, he had allowed his own assumptions to creep in, even if only for a moment. He hadn't fully understood the situation when it began. He hadn't questioned the officer's behavior, and now he felt a deep sense of regret. As the staff prepared to continue with their work, the owner approached Tasha, who was still inspecting the kitchen, checking for health code violations with the same professionalism she always brought to her job. Her demeanor was calm, focused, unaffected by the tension that had unfolded just moments earlier. She was doing what she came to do, and doing it well. The owner cleared his throat, gathering his thoughts. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer than before, "I just want to take a moment to apologize for what happened earlier. I should have intervened sooner. I didn't understand the full situation, and I allowed things to escalate unnecessarily. I should have trusted you right from the start." Tasha paused for a brief moment, then looked at the restaurant owner with a steady gaze. "Thank you for saying that," she replied calmly, her tone neither harsh nor dismissive. "It means a lot that you've recognized what happened here. It wasn't easy for anyone, but it's important that we all remember not to judge people based on appearance, no matter who they are." The owner nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. "You're absolutely right, and I want to thank you for how you handled yourself. The way you remained professional and composed despite the circumstances was truly admirable. I can't tell you how much I respect that." Tasha offered a small, appreciative smile. "It's all part of the job," she said simply, "but I do appreciate your words." There was a brief silence between them, the atmosphere lighter now that the apology had been made. Tasha could sense the owner's sincerity, and that was enough for her. She had no desire to dwell on the past, no desire to continue to linger in the awkwardness. She returned to her inspection, checking the kitchen, noting the small improvements needed here and there. She didn't let the earlier incident color her work. She was here for a reason, and that reason was bigger than the small-minded actions of one officer or the discomfort of an entire room. Officer Jake hesitated just outside the kitchen. He could hear the faint sounds of Tasha moving around, inspecting the restaurant. His palms were sweating. He hadn't expected this part to be easy. Apologizing, especially after everything that had happened, was never easy. But he knew he needed to do it. Taking another deep breath, he walked into the kitchen, stopping just short of Tasha. She didn't look up at first, continuing her inspection as though nothing had changed, her focus sharp. "Ma'am," Jake began, his voice somewhat strained but sincere. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened earlier. I should have never assumed anything about you. It was wrong of me to treat you the way I did, and I deeply regret it." Tasha finally looked up from her notes, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger there, no bitterness, only calm understanding. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It's not about what happened in that moment. It's about understanding that people deserve to be treated with respect, regardless of their race, their appearance, or their job title. It's something we all need to remember." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. "You're absolutely right," he replied. "And I'll do better. I'll make sure that this never happens again. I've learned a lot from this." Tasha offered him a small, knowing smile, a gesture of grace that only made the apology feel more genuine. "I hope so," she said softly. "It's not about being perfect. It's about learning and doing better." Jake stood there for a moment, taking in her words. He wasn't sure how to fully express the impact this moment had on him, but he knew it was something he wouldn't forget. Without another word, he turned and left the kitchen, his head held a little higher than before. He knew that he had a lot of work to do, work on himself, on his biases, on his assumptions. But at least now, he understood the importance of doing so. As the day went on, Tasha finished her inspection, wrapping up her notes and ensuring everything was in order. The restaurant owner thanked her once more before she left, his demeanor now one of true respect. She had done her job, had maintained her professionalism, and in doing so, had reminded everyone in that room of the importance of treating others with dignity and respect. For Tasha, it wasn't about the apology or the recognition. It was about the work she was doing, and the quiet strength she carried with her every day. The moment had been uncomfortable, yes, but it had also been a reminder that no matter what challenges she faced, she was always going to stand tall. And in that quiet victory, she knew that she had made a difference. Not just in the restaurant, but in the hearts of the people who had witnessed the truth unfold. And that, to her, was the most important part of all. As Tasha stepped out of the restaurant, the door swinging softly behind her, she felt the weight of the day lifting from her shoulders. The tension that had once hung in the air had dissipated, replaced by something quieter, something more reflective. She had done what she came to do, completed her job with integrity and professionalism, remained calm in the face of prejudice, and ultimately left a mark on everyone who had witnessed what had unfolded. Outside, the cool air was a welcome change after the intensity of the moment inside. Tasha took a deep breath, allowing herself a brief moment of peace before heading to her car. She had experienced countless moments like the one that day, moments when the world saw her not for who she was, but for the color of her skin. Yet with every experience, she grew stronger. She had learned how to stand her ground, how to keep her composure when the world tried to make her feel small. Today had been no different. But as she walked toward her car, she couldn't help but wonder about the others, the ones who had been there, who had witnessed the confrontation. Officer Jake, the restaurant staff, they would all go home that evening, but would they really understand? Would they take a hard look at their own actions and examine their own biases? Or would they simply dismiss the incident as just another uncomfortable moment? Back inside the restaurant, the atmosphere had changed. The restaurant owner was still standing by the front, his hands clasped together as he stared thoughtfully at the empty space where Tasha had just been. The staff was quiet, some continuing their work, others lost in thought. No one was quite sure what to say. But one thing was certain: the events of the past hour had shaken everyone to their core. Officer Jake, still lingering near the entrance, was the one most deeply affected. He had spent his career policing his town, but today, for the first time, he had questioned his own actions. He had judged Tasha solely on the color of her skin, and he had done so without even realizing it. He had tried to justify it, tried to convince himself that he was just doing his job, but deep down, he knew the truth. His actions had been influenced by bias, an unconscious belief that people like Tasha didn't belong in certain spaces. He had used his badge to push someone aside, to diminish her, all based on an assumption that had no basis in fact. As he stood there, his gaze drifting to the door through which Tasha had just exited, he felt a sinking feeling in his chest. His pride had been wounded in that moment. There was no denying that. But as much as it pained him to admit it, he had learned something today. Something he could no longer ignore. He had allowed his biases to shape his actions, and in doing so, he had hurt someone who didn't deserve it. And now, as the weight of that realization settled in, he knew that he had to make a change. It wasn't just about apologizing to Tasha. It was about doing better, not just for her, but for everyone who crossed his path. The restaurant owner, too, had been affected by the events of the day. He had seen the way the situation had escalated, the way it had made everyone uncomfortable, and it had struck a chord with him. He had allowed his own assumptions to cloud his judgment, too. When Officer Jake had spoken to Tasha the way he did, the owner hadn't stepped in. He had stood back, unsure of how to handle the situation, but now he understood that it wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was a matter of doing what was right. He had allowed someone to be disrespected, and he had done nothing to stop it. That was not the kind of person he wanted to be. "I was wrong," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else in the room. He knew he had to do better, not just as a business owner, but as a person. The lesson had been a painful one, but it was one he wouldn't forget. The rest of the staff, too, was left with something to think about. Most had watched the situation unfold in silence, unsure of how to react. They had seen Tasha's calm and composed response, and they had seen Officer Jake's assumption. But what had really stood out to them was Tasha's grace. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't argued. She had simply stood firm in her truth, and in doing so, she had taught everyone in the room a lesson. That day, they all left with a new understanding of respect and of what it meant to truly look beyond appearances and see people for who they were. As Tasha drove away, the restaurant behind her fading into the distance, she couldn't help but think about what had just transpired. The apology from Officer Jake had been unexpected, and she had appreciated it. But more than that, she had appreciated the shift in the room. She had witnessed a moment of growth, of realization, from people who had been blind to their own biases. And that was a small victory in itself. As much as the world may try to divide us based on the color of our skin, on our gender, or on any other outward characteristic, moments like these remind us that change is possible. It doesn't come easily. It doesn't come without effort. But change is possible, and it starts with reflection, with understanding, and with a willingness to do better. When we judge people based on the color of their skin, we miss the chance to truly know them, to appreciate them for their unique experiences, their strengths, and their character. And it's not just the people around us who suffer. It's us, too. We miss out on the richness of the world, on the lessons that come from diversity, on the beauty of human connection. Tasha had always believed in the power of respect and understanding, and in that moment she knew that the small ripple she had created today could eventually make waves. It was the kind of ripple that had the power to change hearts and minds, to shift perspectives, and to challenge assumptions. And while it may take time, it was a ripple worth creating. As the car sped down the road, Tasha thought about the words she had lived by her entire life. Respect and understanding go a long way. We should never judge a person by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Today, she had seen those words come to life, and in that, there was hope.